Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Copycamp. My name is Jarosław Lipszyc, and I'm the moderator and host of today's session. Our conference started 9 years ago, and I'm very happy that we can meet again in 2020. Unfortunately, in a pandemic format. We hope it will get better next year. During Copycamp, we discuss copyright in an interesting and engaging way. It's an event on law, but it's not a law conference. For the past 9 years, we share our experiences in an international interdisciplinary group of artists, experts, scientists, and social activists. We show how law related to copyright is important to everyone. We discuss the real social impact of this regulation. Copycamp is being organized by Modern Poland Foundation. We are running the most popular internet library in Poland. We are based in Warsaw, Poland. And this library is why we began by being interested in copyright in the first place. We are happy that you share this passion with us. We would like to thank our partner, Google, who decided to support Copycamp in this unusual year, despite, out of necessity, unusual format. In the first part of the session, speakers present their speeches. Each one will be about 12 minutes long. And after 3 speeches, we start questions and answers session. You could ask questions on the YouTube chat or via Matrix and on the copycamp.pl website. You will find all the necessary links. We will choose to ask as many questions to our guest speakers today as possible. And thank you for coming. If there is anything we should improve before tomorrow's sessions, please let us know in the comments. This is the very first time we are organizing such conference, and we definitely need your feedback. The title of today's session is Pandemic, Regulatory Framework and Practices. And our speakers are Lisa Macklem from Canada, Teresa Nobre from Portugal, and Susan Isiko Štrba from South Africa. I would like to ask Teresa Nobre to begin the conference. Teresa is the Vice President of Communion, network devoted to preserving and protecting public domain. Teresa is an attorney at law based in Lisbon, Portugal. She's also the Creative Commons Portuguese chapter lead. And she represents Comunia at World Intellectual Property Organization, Standing Committee of Copyright. The title of her presentation is Copyright and Remote Teaching During the Pandemics. Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. So I will be talking about an issue that is very dear to me. And I will ask you just to confirm that you can see my slides correctly. I hope so. I'll be talking about this topic that's very dear to me because, as some of you might be aware, Comunia has worked a lot during the copyright reform, advocating for a copyright exception for educational uses that would be fit for the digital age and would be fit for remote teaching and the type of teaching that we are conducting during the pandemic. Unfortunately, the work that we have done, it was successful in many ways, but most of the countries in the European Union have not yet implemented the directive. The directive needs to be implemented until June 2021. And so far, we are still relying on existing exceptions. And of course, we are seeing problems with relying on the existing exceptions because they are not fit for these types of teaching. And even the new one that will come with the new directive when it's implemented will still not be entirely fit for what we need right now with online education. But let's just start, from a basic perspective. around the types of rights that are involved in online education and classroom education. So as you are aware, classroom education is centered around performance. When I show something, when I read something, when I recite, when I play in a classroom a music piece or a theater play, this is all considered to be a performance. Whereas when I do the same things online on a Zoom class, this is all considered, showing, reading, reciting, playing, is all considered to be a communication, or it triggers, at least triggers, the right of communication to the public. Okay, so the problem with copyright is that where public performance is not harmonized at EU level, communication to the public right is indeed harmonized at EU level. And this creates problems insofar as countries, when they were dealing with the public performance right, they could do things like saying that school performances are out of copyright. They are not protected by the public performance right. Or instead, and these type of things were things done by the Netherlands, Italy. They all say that, this type of performance, they are not public performances because students in a classroom are not public. So they are not within the scope of the public performance right. This was the case of some countries, and other countries did say, okay, this is a school performance is still a performance to the public, but is allowed under exceptions for education. So there were exceptions for education that were covering school performances. Now, the problem when we go to the same type of acts, which are now called communications, not more performances, because the audience is not in the same place where the communication originates. The problem is that, because I told you this right is harmonized at EU level, countries do not have the flexibility to say that school communications are out of copyright. And of course, they can implement exceptions to the right of communication to the public, but they haven't done so far, or many haven't done properly. And I should also say, that according to the case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union, it's also not clear if a school communication is a communication to the public, because the concept of public is that is we are in the face of an indeterminable number of people and a potentially large number of people, and a classroom would not be such a large or indeterminable number of people. Still, that's something that's not decided, not set at the EU level, and at the national level, there's little flexibility to say that school communications would be out of copyright. So we have to rely on exceptions, and those exceptions that exist are problematic because some covers all types of works, but others do not. Where others limit who can use the works, so they might say that you can use, teachers and students can rely on the exception, but parents cannot rely on the exception. And now with remote teaching being conducted from our homes, and parents being an important supporter of the education activities that are being conducted remotely, they would need to be considered beneficiaries of these exceptions. And some exceptions do not allow them because they have these limits on the beneficiaries. And other types of limitations are on where the work can be used. So some exceptions, they really say that you can only use in the school venues or in the classroom or in certain technological environments that are not neutral, and that would, for instance, prevent you from using email or a closed group on Facebook or a WhatsApp group to share materials and conduct education, because let's not forget that in many countries of the world, mobile is indeed the device that is being used, and WhatsApp groups are important in some countries of the world to conduct educational activities and share materials. So this is just an example. And then the other example, as I told you, is what can be done. So some exceptions will cover public performances, but not public communications, which are the things that we need to do right now. So in terms of solutions, right now, what we are seeing is that basically we have three options, and most of the people are probably on the first option, which is relying on right holders and authors not enforcing their rights. So that's pretty much the scene when you don't have laws in place that allow you these types of uses. Of course, some countries will try to do something, and they try to do something, and they did. Unfortunately, I only have one example to show you, which is Hungary. So Hungary passed an emergency law where they extended the existing exceptions to cover also the right of communication to the public, or as they call it, the right of transmission. So their exceptions would be fit for the types of uses that we need right now. Another option would be for some sort of declarations or resolutions, and we have been trying to push for this idea at WIPO, at the Standing Committee on Copyright and Related Rights. Last week we were in this committee, and we really were asking for some sort of declaration that would provide some interpretation on existing flexibilities, interpret the right of quotation, interpret whatever rights that exist and are mandatory, but also the ones that are optional in terms of access to works for purposes of education. And finally, the other solution that I think we also need to rely on is on a balanced interpretation of copyright laws by the courts. And on that level of reliance, there's three things that I have seen, three ideas that I've seen coming up during the pandemic. One is like saying that we have a fair use that's based on quotation. Professor Lionel Bentley has just released a work that will say that fair use already exists at a global level, including in EU, based on the right of quotation. Then we have a fair use that would already exist based on freedom of expression. Professor Christoph Geiger has been asking and calling for that, and has done an extensive examination of court decisions that lay down criteria that could be considered similar to the fair use factors. And then finally, we would have something that we at Comunia advocated for during the pandemic, which was saying that we could use fundamental rights as a derogation, as an external derogation, provided that these external rights, these fundamental rights, would not allow you to make uses that would go beyond the existing exceptions and limitations. And I don't have much more time. I think I have one more minute or two, but the idea here is that there's these three case laws from July 2019 from the Court of Justice that say that you cannot use fundamental rights to allow derogations to the exclusive rights that go beyond the existing exceptions and limitations. And what we are saying is that the exceptions that exist right now in the EU law, namely in the InfoSoc directive, would allow countries to do all of the things that they are doing, that teachers and educators are doing on remote teaching during the pandemic. And what we are saying is that if the existing exceptions in those countries are more narrow than the exceptions that they could have based on the InfoSoc, then you don't need to have these exceptions in place. You can use fundamental rights standards to say that you can allow those things that you would be allowed under the InfoSoc directive or under other EU laws that you didn't interpret it in the full scope that you were allowed to, but instead you interpret it more narrowly. So, as I said, I only have 1 minute, so I'm happy to discuss that further. But these are the current solutions. In terms of future solutions, as I told you, we have a new copyright directive, mandates that member states should have in place an education exception covering digital uses. And it has a legal fiction that's very important for online users that says that if we have teachers and students located in different countries, we will consider that the uses are taking place on the place where the educational establishment is located. And of course, that's super important for educational activities that are taking place across borders. It's still not perfect, because if the students are outside of the EU, this will not cover those students, because those countries don't have a similar legal fiction. We would need an international treaty for that. And it's also difficult for joint programs being run by different educational establishments located in different member states, because the legal fiction is centered around the place where the educational establishment, and it only considers one, is located. So if we have different educational establishments, it doesn't work very well. So that's it. Thank you so much. You can read our paper also. It's also available on our website, on communityassociation.org. And I'm happy to discuss this further. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you to all the participants. Please keep in mind that you can ask questions to Teresa on copycamp.pl website or in the comments on the YouTube stream. The speakers will answer the questions. After we finish presentations. And now I would like to invite Lisa Macklem, who is a PhD candidate in law at the University of Western Ontario, and whose research focuses on digital content delivery, intellectual property, and the entertainment industry. The title of the presentation is Lessons from the Pandemic, Best Practices, Travel Well. Thank you. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to set up my timer here. All right, so thank you so much for that introduction. I can skip over mine. When COVID-19 lockdown first happened in March of 2020, millions of students and teachers left their physical classrooms for virtual ones. People worked from home and had to entertain themselves at home. In the midst of all this disruption, teachers across North America also worried about what practices were legal and ethical. Some clear takeaways quickly emerged. First, fair dealing practices in Canada and fair use practices in the United States, which were already in place in the physical classroom, supported the same practices done remotely. Secondly, the public interest goals and users' rights of copyright law also support robust and liberal readings of fair dealing and fair use. Thirdly, technological neutrality supports the digital classroom. In sum, best practices in the classroom travel online. It was vital that access to education continue, and this access was not limited to the classroom, but also encompassed education about best practices during the pandemic. When the Black Lives Matter movement began in the US and spread worldwide, access to and control of culture and cultural history also became a part of this conversation. It has never been more important for people to take advantage of their users' rights as large copyright holders attempt to push back, reorganize, and to lock down access. On the official website of the Government of Canada, it lists the objectives of copyright law, and I'm quoting here from the website. Canadian copyright laws and regulations are designed to ensure that the rights of creators and other rights holders are recognized and protected, and to promote access to copyrighted works. Canada's domestic copyright framework must also meet our international obligations and be consistent with international standards endorsed by Canada. Effective copyright protection is key to cultural expression, citizen engagement, and economic growth powered by the rapid expansion of the knowledge-based economy, end quote. It's important to note that the Supreme Court of Canada has reiterated since 2002 that, quote, jurisprudence has sought to calibrate the appropriate balance between creators' rights and users' rights, end quote. The Supreme Court also emphasized the public interest aspect of the fair dealing exception, stating that, quoting, dissemination of works is also one of the Act's purposes, which means that dissemination too, with or without creativity, is in the public interest, end quote. Thus, legislation, governmental intent, and jurisprudence would all appear to be consistent. So the clear takeaways are that fair dealing and fair use practices that are already in place supported the change to remote teaching. Any analysis of copyright infringement begins with whether or not the use is actually infringing. If the use is infringing, then the user may move to the exceptions. In Canada, this is a two-part test. The first issue is whether the use is an allowable purpose. It is important to note that while many countries have similar fair dealing or fair use provisions, there are nuances that have to be considered. In comparing the Canadian and US systems, there are two major differences. In Canada, fair dealing has a closed list of allowable purposes: research, private study, parody, satire, education, criticism, review, and news reporting. US fair use, on the other hand, adopts a non-exclusive but illustrative list of criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Furthermore, the second part of the Canadian analysis relies on a list of 6 factors that are set out by the Federal Court of Appeal's decision in the CCH case and adopted by the Supreme Court of Canada, while the American 4-factor test is enumerated within statute. Both systems, however, support the purpose of education, research, and private study. It is important to lean into the purpose of the use when moving through the factors of analysis. For instance, reading aloud is not being done for entertainment purposes within the context of a classroom. Reading aloud serves a number of very specific educational purposes, such as it helps to build community, teach vocabulary and pronunciation, and develop information processing skills. A film class does not watch an entire film for entertainment purposes, but to teach students how to analyze or critique a film, or to teach students how to become directors, writers, or actors. Secondly, public interest goals of copyright law are also supported. A pandemic in which the safety of everyone depends upon social distancing would clearly support engaging with exceptions that allow education to continue remotely. In particular, taking a more liberal approach to the provisions within copyright acts that specify that education should take place on the premises of the educational institution should be expanded to include the digital classroom of learning management systems. Third, technological neutrality equally supports a digital classroom fair dealing, fair use. The doctrine of technological neutrality has been well articulated by Canadian courts. In Robertson v. Thompson Corp., the Supreme Court stated that, quote, "The principle of technological neutrality requires that the Copyright Act apply equally between traditional and more technologically advanced forms of the same media," end quote. Justice Isabella and Moldover, writing for the Supreme Court of Canada, stated that, quote, "It makes little sense to distinguish between two methods of selling the same work, for the primary reason that doing so violates the principle of technological neutrality, which requires that the act apply equally, notwithstanding the technological diversity of different forms of media," end quote. There is little reason to view the digital classroom differently than the physical one. Fourth, best practices in the classroom travel online. I'll come back to this in a moment. Initially, it was considered that the emergency move to online learning led to questionable practices that would be overlooked in the public interest. With the shift to what has become the new normal, it is clear that those practices were not questionable, but based in sound legal precedents. So, takeaways. Can making use of fair dealing or fair use push a generally more liberal approach? Can educational institutions establish deeper understandings of the purposes behind the use of works that can then be extrapolated to a wider approach? This would seem to be a natural extension, as at least in Canada and the US, the educational purpose is linked to private research and scholarship as well. What about improving best practices, increasing awareness of rights? If educational institutions are going to take a leadership role, it is important that their best practices are fundamentally sound. Western has a very helpful website that goes through good practices, and I'm not going to spend time here doing that. I'm certainly not proposing that creators or owners of copyrighted material aren't entitled to fair remuneration for their work. I am not proposing widespread piracy. On the contrary, better established and delineated practices make material more available with less uncertainty where appropriate. However, another stumbling block is a widespread lack of understanding about users' rights. Lastly, more access to cultural benefits movements like Black Lives Matter. When the Black Lives Matter movement, while it's certainly not the first to shed light on the difficulty of accessing cultural heritage, its basis in the United States during the pandemic allowed it to be picked up globally. The widespread protests in one of the most powerful nations in the world gave those protests a more powerful voice. The pandemic also helped to focus people's attention. So, what are best practices? First of all, making use of open access and public domain resources that do not trigger a copyright analysis. Increasingly, scholarly journals are moving to this model. Controlled digital lending. This is about replicating with digital lending the legal and economically significant aspects of physical lending. There are a number of provisions that can be implemented to ensure that there is no copyright infringement. First, ensuring that original works are acquired lawfully. Secondly, apply CDL only to works that are owned and not licensed. 3, limit the total number of copies in any format in circulation at any time to the number of physical copies the library lawfully owns. That is maintaining an owned to loan ratio, a 1-to-1 ratio. 4, lend each digital version only to a single user at a time, just as a physical copy would be loaned. 5, limit the time period for each lend to one that is analogous to physical lending, say 2 weeks. And lastly, 6, use digital rights management to prevent wholesale copying and redistribution. In reality, CDL really relies on the first sale doctrine, which allows a user to do whatever they wish with their legally acquired copy, such as resell, lend, display, or dispose of that copy, though they are restricted from making unauthorized copies. CDL only lends the digital version of the physical copies they own. CDL serves the public interest in allowing access to books when people physically cannot get to a library because of a pandemic or simple lack of access. Next, 3, use licensed library materials. Educational institutions spend a great deal of money acquiring licensed materials through purchases of books and databases every year. 4, attribute sources. This is a requirement for a number of different uses, and in the educational context provides an important learning moment. It's also ingrained in academic practices. 5, use learning management systems. Keeping educational materials on learning management systems means that those materials are not being widely distributed to the public at large. A student has to be enrolled in the course in order to have access to the materials. This is another way that digital education environment can easily maintain the technologically neutral analogy with the physical classroom. Learning management systems also routinely restrict access after a certain time, so that even students enrolled in the course would cease to have access after a prescribed time, say a month, after the course ends. Even if material is posted on YouTube, it can be maintained as a private channel with access granted only to those given access. We still have a lot of hurdles to overcome, though. First of all, there's institutional pushback and risk aversion. Unfortunately, decisions regarding copyright policies are often made by non-experts in the field. University legal counsel are only doing their jobs and being risk averse. However, university legal counsel are generally experts in corporate law and may lack the necessary insights into the nuances of intellectual property law. For instance, the Supreme Court of Canada has explicitly stated that the availability of a license has no bearing on a finding of fair dealing. A recent case in Canada that will soon be heard at the Supreme Court is the York University versus the Canadian Copyright Licensing Agency, otherwise known as Access Copyright. Access Copyright is a national collection agency in Canada. The Federal Court of Appeals decision was that Access Copyright's tariffs were not mandatory. Universities, as already mentioned, already pay royalties through acquisitions of books and databases. Again, no one is claiming that creators should not be paid fairly, just not twice. Secondly, misinformation and misunderstanding. Instructors from graduate students to part-time lecturers to full professors have been struggling with simply putting their materials online, learning how to Zoom, and finding alternative materials without having to also grapple with copyright issues. There's a great deal of misinformation and misunderstanding. For instance, asynchronous delivery of lectures is not served well by using the analogy of a copy. In fact, the better analogy for an asynchronous lecture, one that's videotaped, recorded, and then left for students to watch at their leisure, is to compare it to taping a program to watch later. Time shifting is well established in US law through the Sony Corporation of America versus Universal Studios Inc. case. Interestingly, it was Mr. Rogers testifying that he wanted parents taping his show for their children to watch either later or repeatedly for the educational value that helped decide that case. Finally, big content and media owners. Perhaps the biggest hurdle to overcome is the influence of studios, publishers, and collective agencies. Institutions such as the Motion Picture Association of America and the Recording Industry Association of America have strong lobbying power that helps them harness the power of the United States Trade Representative, who most recently stepped into the Copyright Act revision process in South Africa, convincing President Cyril Ramaphosa to refer the Copyright Amendment Bill and the Performers Protection Amendment Bill back to the National Assembly on June 22nd, 2020. This is particularly concerning for a region that routinely struggles with availability of educational materials such as affordable textbooks. The US copyright maximalists have long influenced copyright through trade deals that introduce TRIPS Plus provisions. On June 1st, 2020, Penguin Random House, Hachette, HarperCollins, and Wiley Publishers sued the Internet Archive, which had announced emergency measures to increase availability of their controlled digital lending library materials. The HathiTrust Digital Library is a large-scale collaborative repository of digital content from research libraries, including content digitized via Google Books, and the Internet Archive digitization initiatives, as well as content digitalized locally by libraries. At Western, where I'm based, we've just signed on to the HathiTrust, but only to the part of the collection in the public domain so far, which is frustrating. It's clear that an upside to the disruption caused by the pandemic is that users are becoming more aware of their rights and how to exploit them. Teachers are finding ways to deliver meaningful content. However, there are still many hurdles to be overcome. Failures of access to culture and education have become more obvious. The need for accurate information has perhaps never been greater. Copyright represents...
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'm afraid your time is up.
Okay, I just had like one sentence. I was just going to say copyright only represents one piece of the puzzle, but it's an important one. A continued emphasis on best practices and expanding awareness of rights is vital. Understanding technical access issues and the nuances between regions are also important, but outside the scope of my paper today.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for stressing the importance of users' rights. That really resonates within today's session. And to everyone listening to us, please remember that you can add your questions to the chat on the YouTube channel or on the copycamp.pl webpage. And now I would like to invite our last speaker today, which is Dr. Susan Isiko Štrba. Hopefully, we had some technical problems due to the internet connection, I believe. I hope we overcome those. Susan combines teaching and research with providing policy and legislative advice to governments and civil society. She focuses mainly on human rights, intellectual property, trade and development. And the title of her speech is Lessons from COVID-19 for Online Teaching. Susan, the floor is yours. Please switch the microphone on the bottom of the screen.
You hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you loud and well. Thank you.
Okay, sorry for that technical hiccup. Even from Switzerland, it happens. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I feel honored. And I'm just going to give a few thoughts concerning Africa. With a caveat, Africa is not one country. There are 55 countries. So I can't pretend to know everything that happens in each of them, but I'll present a global view or an overview of what I think. My focus is really on online teaching, and a lot of things that I would have wanted to say as introduction have been said by my colleagues, my previous colleagues. So I think I can just say hi and thank you and go home. But I'll still say something about Africa. Yeah, we need to understand the general landscape is that most of the legislation in Africa, because here we are talking about legislation, in many African countries, like in many developing countries anyway, the focus or the feeling that there could be some access was through limitations and exceptions, because anyway, that's what the international instruments provide. You can access protected works through limitations and exceptions. So this focus is fortunately or unfortunately reflected in the legislation of most countries. And it focuses mainly on face-to-face, which is understandable at the time when the agreements and international agreements were drafted and were translated into national law. The concern was really on face-to-face, or just access the material, and by that time teaching was face-to-face. As I mentioned in my book on access to education in developing countries, was really the need for bulk access to printed material, and that is understandable, it's reflected. So you have limitations and exceptions for face-to-face teaching. Some institutions or some universities can have they've gone ahead to have some kind of regulations or instruments for long distance learning, but there's really little on online teaching or research-based teaching, online teaching. This, I'm trying to be cautious of my 10 minutes, but what I've just summarized was actually properly documented in 3 WIPO studies by the World Intellectual Property Organization, which reflects the situation on the ground. It is arguable, though, that face-to-face limitations and exceptions can be used in online, like Lisa has been demonstrating, and some people have argued so much around the use of a twist or interpretation of provision like fair use, fair dealing, and how they can apply to online. But I want to come especially to what I'll call the current situation, or what might become, as the World Bank has named it, the new normal, is that we have completely online. It will be very surprising that the copyright owners will just watch and say, okay, this is just an interpretation of what maybe has been accepted, like Lisa has demonstrated the CCH Canadian case, or the CCH case against the Law Society of Upper Canada. But it will be very, very surprising. And this is what is really happening. And what we've observed, at least in Africa, and even here in Europe, in Switzerland, where I sit, is that moving online, besides the fact that it was an emergency, it also gave opportunities to some people, including the copyright owners, to manage their property better or more. And what do I mean?
I'm afraid, Teresa, that we can't hear you. You need to switch on the microphone again. We can't hear you. The microphone was switched off, unfortunately, somehow.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, now we can hear you.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah,
it's okay.
Okay, so where did you stop to hear me? I blame your
just
ears.
Few seconds. Just last 15 seconds. So no worry.
Strange. Let me put the cursor really far away, just in case. I'm so sorry about that. So from what courts are pronounced, like in Canada? Is that where we stopped?
I think we stopped when you were going to talk about the right holders found new ways of managing.
Yes, so I
right.
mentioned, thank you. I mentioned the dictum rights management, which Teresa even also mentioned, but now it's working more effectively. At least in the EU, there are some demands or some legislation that if one has a copyright exception and limitations, and then they should be facilitated to be able to use it. It's not the case in most African countries. So when you have the digital rights management, when you have these digital locks applied to material that is being transmitted online, people are really locked out. And this is happening a lot. So you have, in the end, it's the rich that are able to study because they can pay to have the material unlocked, to have the transmission unlocked. Oh, what I forgot is to share my slides. I'm so sorry. I was excited. Should I still show it? I think let's just continue. And one of the things that you notice, or those who are teaching on online, is that you get a pop-up window when one starts to read, and you have to tick whether the material has been cleared by copyright, whether there's a contract, whether it's copied. I mean, one has to go these filters. And that brings the second point. It's not just a digital rights management, but now you have the platform holders or the platform providers managing the education because they can screen the copyright. So, and they manage and decide now which educational material can be used. And is that a problem for only Africa? And that's where I want to be a little to push you a bit more. It is not. That just in Africa or in many developing countries, it adds to the already challenges of access to technology. Though this particular problem, platforms managing digital rights management, it will not be solved by just access to technology. It's more about being able to pay for it, which most people, even in developed countries, even here in Switzerland where I'm sitting, they are not able to pay for everything. That's why you need some kind of arrangements between the states and the rights holders, and not all states are able to negotiate or to come up with solutions. Some rights holders have been so kind and they've given temporary access, especially when we had the first lockdown, there was temporary access to negotiation to their material. But yesterday I was reading an article from Mexico, and the students were lamenting that at first they had this temporary access, now it's not there. So there has to be a plan B, but how? When people are locked up, people don't have jobs, they are poor. We are not saying that right holders should, I would reiterate my colleague's point, they should give their material for free, but there are situations like now where really it's an emergency for everyone. And one would think that maybe copyright could be waived, but again, that's where we have to crack our nuts. Where do you draw the line? Do you support the right holder that he has to earn from it, or do you support the learner? And I'll just mention that unlike many countries in Europe and the West, you don't have many emergency orders, for example. I mean, emergency laws that are written really in black and white. But yes, people have responded to emergency, and there's been kind of hiding in the fact that there's no enforcement in the moment, because there's so much chaos, there's so many other worries, but there's no enforcement. But I've been asking, what will happen when this emergency feeling or perception stops, and we now have to deal with the copyright industry, or we have to deal with copyright issues? And that also presupposes, my question presupposes, that people even have access. They have the money to go around the digital rights management. They have to go around the locks that are created by the platform. So there are three issues that I'm raising. You have the technological problems that are already there, the right holders are taking advantage of. But you also have the future policy challenges when people are not nice or they are not sympathetic anymore, and really they can claim their rights. What will happen? And this brings me to my last slide. What could be the lessons? I think there's a need to prepare, to build some kind of preparedness. And this might mean that different countries in Africa or in the world, those in developing countries and developed countries that are really being challenged by copyright, to prepare, what if there are other pandemics? And even if there are no pandemics, I'm afraid to say that this online teaching is going to be a new normal, really, that there's be a lot of teaching online. So there has to be a rethinking of the copyright system. There has to be, without being on the bargaining side, because it's like the copyright industry is somewhere and then the rest have to bargain, and we have to work around the limitations and perceptions. But one thing that is clear, not all of them, and most of them cannot be working in the digital environment. So I find it a misnomer that we have to go back. Terry has just mentioned the negotiations in the SCCR, that we have to go back and use old texts and try and negotiate based on those texts for access to online or to, that's all. I think there's a problem with the law, which we have to work out. I stop there for now.
Thank you, Susan. That was perfect. Thank you for your insight. Now we move to the question, and the first question is from Radek Czajka to Lisa. It would be interesting to see how this affects teacher cooperation. Would sharing educational materials between teachers meant for use in their digital classrooms be still educational, fair dealing? Lisa, this is the question for you.
Yes, it is. If you're using the materials for educational uses, just because somebody else is using them doesn't mean they're no longer being used for educational uses. Now, if you were, and I mean that happens regularly in classes that are team taught, right? You want to make sure that there is a cohesion across multiple sections. So I'm actually teaching a writing course right now that's team taught, and we share our lectures and and assignments and all of those things. So they're still behind a learning management system. They would still go through, and I didn't go through them because I didn't want to spend the time going through the 6 factors, but they're nonprofit. Nobody's, paying for education doesn't count as for profit. So yeah, I would think that those would definitely still fall under.
Thank you. Another question, next question is for Susan. This notion of platforms serving as gatekeepers for educational materials is very interesting. Do you maybe have some concrete stories to tell about this problem, Susan?
No, thank you. I'm glad the person used even a better word, gatekeepers, platforms working as gatekeepers. Just I was rushing through, but I have an example of one university here in Canada, Lisa, in a developed country, and they have to screen. There is a kind of criteria, and Western University. There's a kind of criteria that it has to screen the instructor before they access the material and before they share it. And that's one. We've had situations. I don't know whoever is asking, but there are so many situations. I've had situations where my children have been studying online during the lockdown, where the system is just shut down, and you have a pop-up on the platform. With all due respect to the platform they use is Google Classroom, and they say that copyright issues, and it pops up in the middle of the class. There've been situations in the UK. I'm reluctant to mention the university where during an exam, a terminal exam, the system just shuts down, and they just blah blah. They put stuff on the platform on the screen. Okay, there it raises even other issues, the panic, the what, but also there are questions of artificial intelligence, because I know what is happening, but that's not our discussion here. But those are just a few examples. And I deliberately chose them from the West, not Africa.
Can I just jump in about the Western question?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so when I go to post something on our learning management system, I am asked, I'm given a list of, do you own the copyright? Is this fair dealing? Is it licensed, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a drop-down menu, and you choose, and I always pick fair dealing because I'm using it for educational. And I think part of the nobody's actually really monitoring this that I'm aware of. And I've looked into it. So it's a matter of educating the educators as well. And in fact, we had a whole series of seminars over the summer at King's dealing with, how do you do Zoom lectures effectively? How do you use Zoom? How do you use VoiceThread? How do you use collaboration? And I did one on how do you handle copyright, so that people knew which of those drop-down things to choose, so that the material would be accessible to students.
My follow-up question to what you just said is you said that we need to educate the teachers, and my objection is do we? Because maybe we should enforce certain policies on platform providers. And because if you can always hide, an option deep in the settings, and educating people is not, as we know already, is not going to make people use it when it's not easily available on the platform. The platforms decide what people click. That's the sad story. It's how you put the information, how you announce the information, how visible this information is, how easy it is to choose the certain settings. Those are the factors which overwhelmingly decide on what people do. So maybe it's not about educating users, it's about enforcing platforms to do certain do certain practices according to the law we already have.
Yeah, it's definitely not just a one-layer problem. And I just wanted to speak to what Susan had said about access as well. Even in North America, even in the US, Canada's broadband is a whole other issue. Our Indigenous people are totally underserved, and it's a whole other issue. But even in the United States, where you'd think would be fine, there's lots of stories about school-age kids having to drive to the local mall and sit in the parking lot to be able to do their homework because they don't have sufficient broadband at home. And you would not expect that in North America or in the US, but it happens even in the US. So I just wanted to pick up on that too.
Can I add something on the platforms issue?
Oh yes, of course.
Because that's another, Comunia is one of the observers on the discussion on upload filters, on the stakeholder dialogue of the European Commission around Article 17, and we did indeed have intense insights and discussions around the role of platforms and the use of filters and artificial intelligence and automated content recognition technologies to access if the use is protected under exceptions, limitations or not. So much of what we've learned is that, and what Susan told is really concerning, because much of what we learn is that indeed the technology that we have nowadays is able to recognize content but not context. So it doesn't matter how much do you teach teachers and students how to use works and their copyright exceptions, if the technology that is being used by platforms is not able to recognize the context and if the use is legal under existing exceptions. So I do think that we have a huge problem there. We have a problem with, on a legal point of view, not allowing contractual overriding of exceptions, so that you can't, under the terms and uses and conditions of use of the platforms, or override the exceptions, but also a problem with allowing and preventing the platforms, and that's a legal problem, preventing the platforms of using automated content recognition technologies to access if a use is legitimate or not. And I mean, we are now regulating these on online content service providers under Article 17, but then we have all these other platforms that will not fall under Article 17, or will, let's see, but that are raising these problems with education. And I think this is indeed very much concerning. And if we, I mean, and one thing is, when we know that what factors exist, like in the fair use factors in the US, in Canada, in places where they are established and well established, or when we have specific exceptions that tell you exactly what to use. But imagine when we start talking about, you know, a fundamental rights approach to the interpretation of exceptions, all of those things can only be made by a judge, by a person, and cannot be made by an algorithm or a technology that relies on artificial intelligence. So I think there is indeed a huge problem. And my concern right now is that platforms are being the ultimate judges and are defining what is permissible or not. So they are the ones that are defining what our exceptions mean in practice. And this was happening with user generated content, and now it's happening in education too. Platforms are the ultimate deciders of what is permitted or not in education, and I think this is so concerning that we leave to private entities this definition of the permissibilities under existing education exceptions, or other or under fundamental rights, or under fair use, or whatever limitations.
Can I say something?
Thank you very much. Yes, of course, please. I will have 2 more questions. So, after you, I will get back to the questions. Okay.
Okay. I want to just respond to my colleague, Lisa. You are completely right that there is a need for education or information. But I was thinking of the situation you actually just mentioned, what happened in South Africa recently. And that's just one. Colombia, okay, in the context of access to medicine. These are the people who are helping with the legislation on the ground. They may know a little bit on how far these limitations and exceptions can go. But then there are contrary interests. The International Intellectual Property Association of the USA, they are people patched on the Section 301, and then there's a threat of trade retaliation. So it becomes difficult, and there it's more than just legislation. I think the more than just information, we need to agree to have a clear instrument on international level that this is really falls in within international interests. For example, here we are talking of emergencies, we're talking of development, what is a developmental cause, or what is a developmental journey for one country. It's not necessary to another, the same to another, and it will not be just enough to educate the masses. There has to be some kind of instrument to force, but also a kind of I don't know, to impose on the decision makers, really. I feel like the word just, I don't have the right word.
Okay, thank you. I would also like to personally add to what Teresa said on platforms, that of course the problem of the platform's control on the information stream is overwhelming, but even like a little steps, like making sure that platforms protect user rights. I mean, it would be really nice if I could download a video from YouTube on my hard drive, which is perfectly legal, for my private use in Poland, but I can't do that. Or to move, to download video from Netflix and move it to another device, which is again perfectly within my legal rights. It's just the software which makes it impossible or extremely difficult. So maybe those little steps will help to improve the system a little bit. But I would like to move to question. Actually, I have a question to all the speakers from Maria Świetlik. Do you see any new allies for copyright reform emerging from this broad pandemic experience that affected people and institutions not really interested deeply in the topic of the copyright before? Is anyone willing to answer that?
Well, I can. I mean, we have been trying to look for those alliances for so many years, and for so long we felt so alone in this battle. And I can definitely see, at least from where I stand, I saw more interest from the academia. That interest was not there for educational purposes or for educational exceptions. And I think that's, the academia was concerned about other issues like upload filters and etc., not so much about educational exceptions. And I've seen more studies and more insights and intellectual thought being put on this issue. And also, I should confess that although we didn't see much improvement in the negotiations at this SCCR, at the Standing Committee on Copyright and Related Rights at WIPO in Geneva last week, I can say that at least there was, from the global north countries, which are normally the biggest obstacle to any intervention on the area of exceptions, I saw some opening. I won't say that they are ready to do something, but at least they were kind of more willing to discuss, and it seems that they were more, they understood better what are the issues and were more sensible to these issues. So I'm not saying that something's coming from there, but having some support from the global north is something kind of new to us in the international policy sphere.
I would absolutely echo what Teresa has said about, more interest from the educational community. I mean, I think in the short term, I mean, we in North America, we were all towards the end of the semester when lockdown happened. So I think people were just kind of like, what do I do? And they just did it. But then as things went on, they're like, okay, well, this is going to go on. So now we have to think about the implications, which they did in a thoughtful way. I mean, I'm disappointed that Western is at this point only going with HathiTrust for their public interest. And I have a library committee meeting later today, so I'm hoping to push this one home a little bit more. But I mean, I think that, those conversations are being opened up. And I think the more we can see expansion for controlled digital lending, I mean, there's still the technological access issue as well. Like, I mean, if you don't have broadband, if you don't have, internet, it doesn't matter. But I mean, I think if we can push those things, that's going to have a long-term and a wide-ranging effect. If we can get people over the idea that it's still a book, it's still lending, it's the same thing. I mean, I think that's going to be another way in to spread the word. And just thinking too about, like, not pandemic related so much, but Black Lives Matter. I mean, that's really opened up a whole other issue as well, in that you would think that the US would have, it's supposed to have one of the best educational systems, people are supposed to have the best access, blah blah blah, and then suddenly we're all learning that Black history in the United States is not in their textbooks, right? So, I mean, I think that opens up a whole other, element of access. And I realize that this is something that other countries have dealt with for years, but I think that the platform that the US gives it is another push to help get it out there and to get more concern about it. And I think that even the entrenched entertainment industry in the U.S. is starting to see that they're going to have to change, what they're doing and how they're serving culture. So I think all of these things have, trickle down effects too, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Thank you, Lisa. And last two questions. One is for Susan. Is it that global north stance on copyright is a kind of colonialism against the South, making it harder for less developed countries to catch up? Susan, if you could comment on that.
Sorry, it's global?
Is the global north position
north.
and enforcement of copyright, is it like a new kind of colonialism, which makes it harder to catch up for the global South?
Oh, this I'll need a whole another session for it, but I'll give it a try. This morning I was having a conversation. I'll answer by an example. This morning I was having a conversation with a diplomat who is negotiating these issues. And he posed me a question, and actually one of the assumption was the global north is actually being nice. They've worked so hard, they've negotiated so many instruments, and they're just allowing access for free to the South. And my question to him was, were the South or at the table in the first place when they were negotiating? So I don't know whether to call it colonialism, but there is some kind of pushing, imperialism, I don't know what terminology, but yes, if the global South were not there at the negotiation, or they were there, but they were not informed enough to participate in the negotiation, yes, I think the ideas of the North are being imposed. I would look at it from that point of view. And I don't know whether colonialism is a term to use, but yes, the North has interest in keeping what they had in mind at the start of the international instruments on copyright and make them align with the new developments, forgetting that the developing countries or the South is also evolving. And the things we can't have a status quo. Right now, we're just talking about online platforms. They never existed before, not even in the North. So to think that archaic instruments, which already had their own flaws, could be the same one statically applied to the current situations, that's more than patriotism. And there, I think one would buy in the argument that that's a kind of colonialism. But I think it's more than that. It's one group that wants to keep the status quo and keep making it better only for themselves. Unfortunately, while we speak about globalization, and the question is, what are we globalizing? Because globalization, I would think, it also means sharing. But there's nothing to share. It's like those who have, they want to have more and get the others to give more in the South. Those are my thoughts. I wish they were off the record, but I think they need to go on the record.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And also, Teresa wants to add something.
Well, I will not put in names. I've said things on Twitter, but I would like to just say from indeed the international table negotiation table, that countries from the global North are still insisting that these issues need to be solved at the local level, and the problem is, and they want to insist on this because they want to have bilateral negotiations with countries, and the pressure you put on a country when you do bilateral negotiations is totally different from when we are all at the same table on a forum like the WIPO forum. And we saw, I mean, what we saw with South Africa is indeed doesn't make the global North countries look well. The pressure that the United States or the European Union, or at least the negotiations that were ongoing and were not very transparent and on that level, shows that we should be insisting for these discussions to be placed at the international level, because I don't think there's really people are on the same position when they have to negotiate bilaterally and suffer the consequences of trade sanctions and etc.
Thank you, and Lisa, I'm afraid this will be the last intervention in this discussion, because we slowly run out of time. But Lisa, please speak.
Okay, I just wanted to jump in because, I touched on this really briefly in my presentation, but this is where, the US can push TRIPS plus provisions, right? And I think it's important to also consider when you're looking at these trade deals, the negotiators are hired because they're good negotiators. They're not hired because they're experts in intellectual property. And I think you're right. I think that, the global South is definitely at a disadvantage. Are you going to protect possible, cultural things that you're not sure how to save, or are you going to negotiate so you get clean water? It's apples and oranges. And I think this is where it turns back into one of the points that Teresa brought up, and the work that Christoph Geiger is doing in foregrounding this as a human right, this access to culture and education. And I think that needs to take a bigger place in trade deals. And that's all I had to say.
Okay, thank you all. Unfortunately, we need to end today's session now. It's 6:15. So thank you all for participating. I would like to thank our speakers, Lisa Maklem, Teresa Nobre, and Susan Isiko Štrba. I would like to thank our audience and for all the questions and engagement. I hope you enjoyed today's sessions. If there is anything we should improve before tomorrow, please let us know in the comments. It's very important for us. This is the very first time we are doing online conference, and we are willing to learn from our mistakes. And I would like to invite you for tomorrow's sessions, which start at 5. Tomorrow, the sessions will be held in Polish. The session in English will be on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Tomorrow is the only session in Polish with the title Lockdown, twórcy i użytkownicy w nowej rzeczywistości. Which is the lockdown users and creators in the new reality. So see you tomorrow for all those who speak Polish, and on Wednesday, everyone who would like to stick to the English. Thank you very much, and well, bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.